You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I am a scientist. I am a scientist. I am a scientist. We gotta live on science alone.
Welcome to Unbiased Science, where we bring scientific method to the madness. I'm your host and public health scientist, Dr. Jess Steyer. And today, the long-awaited episode on microplastics. I have seen your messages. I have read all of them. I myself, as a public health data scientist, did not feel equipped to tackle this topic solo, so I brought in the big guns. I'm joined by not one, but two brilliant toxicologists who are going to really help me do a deep dive on this topic. What are microplastics? What are sources of microplastics? How do we get exposed to them? How nervous should we be? And are there ways to mitigate risk? So in prepping for this episode, and I'm going to introduce our two guests in just one moment, I just typed in microplastic just to see what would pop up on my page. There are hundreds of social media posts and news articles in the major media outlets. Just from Washington Post a week ago, microplastics are everywhere. Why don't we know what they do to our health? Let's see. I guess USA Today picked up on a study that we'll talk about today, microplastics in arteries linked with heart disease risk. Anyway, all kinds of things. Study links microplastics to increased heart attack and stroke risks. It's everywhere. So I'm sure you've all seen articles and posts on this topic. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our two guests for today. I will start with someone who you've heard on the podcast, I guess. When was it, Chris? I think it must have been about a year ago at this point. I'm losing track of time. But Dr.
It could have been.
Right? Dr. Christopher Weiss, if it's okay, I'll call you Chris during this episode.
Please.
Chris joined us on the pod to talk about PFAS. That was a really great episode, and he's back to talk about microplastics. So I'll read a bio, but really none of this does justice to either of our guests. But Dr. Christopher Weiss served as Senior Advisor and Toxicology Liaison for the Director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Science at the National Institutes of Health. He represented the director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Science and the National Toxicology Program on national and international committees, task forces, and ad hoc working groups. Before joining NIEHS in August of 2010, he served for 9 years as the forensic toxicologist for the National Enforcement Investigation Center in Denver. He has more than 30 years of experience characterizing environmental exposures and hazards for chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological, and explosive materials. He completed, I could go on, but I'll wrap up by saying he completed his PhD in toxicology and medical physiology at Michigan State University. He's been awarded 2 NIH fellowships, blah, 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 all the good things. Amazing. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm glad to be here. And I survived all that.
Yeah. Seriously. And Dr. Norb Kaminsky, who joined us just a couple of weeks ago to talk about heavy metals. In particular, we were chatting about lead and how that's recently been found in, what were we talking about, Norb? In baby food pouches, as well as, why am I blanking? Stanley
potentially
cups.
in water. And, we talked about the cups.
Yes, Stanley cups. I hope we allayed some concerns and let people know that they didn't need to necessarily toss their Stanley cups. But just a brief reminder that Dr. Norb Kaminsky holds a PhD in toxicology and physiology. He's the director of the Institute for Integrative Toxicology at Michigan State and the interim director of the Center for Research on Ingredient Safety. And Chris just let me know before we hit record that Norb is actually the director of the institute from which Chris received his PhD. Did I get that right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. And very happy to do it. And it's a great place. It's a wonderful place. Thanks to the leadership that's there, Norb.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, and thanks, Jess, for inviting me back.
Absolutely. So let's get into it. And I don't know, how to direct questions. I know you both could answer these questions, but what are microplastics? And then as a continuation of that question, I've also heard this term nanoplastic. So is it just a matter of difference in size? I've also heard about primary microplastics, secondary microplastics, and I have some definitions that I pulled here, but I'd much rather hear from you if you could sort of summarize, what are we talking about here?
As you said, size really is the main distinguishing factor between micro and nano. And again, it depends on who you're reading as to what really constitutes nano. Some of the scientific literature I'm reading is anything smaller than 100 micrometers, but typically nano refers to things that are less than 100 nanometers in size. And I've seen it for the plastics where they've kind of gone up a little bit higher in size. But clearly these are, at least the nanoparticles are very, very small. And those are the ones I think that people are most concerned about, because as these particles get smaller and smaller, there is concern that they can cross biological barriers, and so that is an issue.
Right, and these, a nanoparticle is way too small to see with your eye. So, without the power of a microscope, perhaps an electron microscope, it's hard to study these things and hard to follow them through biological systems without those advanced tools.
But I was going to add a little bit to this, because this whole area, especially of nanoparticles, gets very complicated too, because typically when we think about particles, we think about them being round, but they don't have to be round, and especially in terms of plastics. So, nano often refers to only one of the three dimensions as being of that small size. And so again, when we're thinking about nanomaterials in general, and we can also relate this to plastics, it's not just the size, it's also the shape, and it's also the composition of the material. And, with plastics, there's a lot of different types of plastics, and, some are used more readily than others, and some are used for various purposes that, again, lead to a higher incidence of exposure for people. And I'm sure we'll get into that as we kind of get on with this conversation.
Yeah.
What we're learning quite recently, folks have been studying microplastic and for a long time, and nanomaterials is not something that's new to science and medicine.
Yep.
But these substances we're learning can apparently cross membranes, can cross cellular membranes. And so, Jessica, you mentioned recent studies on the cardiovascular system, and there are related studies on the nervous system showing that, in fact, these infinitesimally small particles can go across biological membranes. Now, that's stirred a lot of interest in the scientific community, and particularly the health community.
Well, actually, this leads me to my next question. I feel like we're jumping around here already, but you're saying so many important and interesting things. Is this a new topic? Is this, I feel like I'm only really hearing about microplastics in the last several months. I mean, is this something that has been on the radar of scientists? Have we been studying this? Is it that the technology hasn't been able to properly measure these things? Or why are we only now hearing about this?
Yeah, to be honest, I think microplastics and nanoplastics, especially microplastics, really started getting on the radar of toxicologists. I don't know, Chris, what do you say, about 10 years ago?
Yeah,
Maybe,
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of that had to do with, the containers in which we drink water from and a lot of other things. And, of course, there's always been a huge concern about plastics in, waterways and, the degradation of these plastics through weathering. And so I think people have become very, very aware of these materials.
Got it.
The amount of plastic just doesn't degrade very quickly at all. It does fall apart eventually, but it takes, decades and decades, perhaps hundreds of years, maybe longer, for these things to dissipate in the environment, to break down into their carbon structures. One of the things that's interesting to me and disturbing as a sailor, I'm learning that the currents in the ocean that cycle in every ocean on the planet circle around like huge eddies. And those eddies have in large areas of the oceans have become filled with plastics, bottles, but even more disturbing, not just visible plastics, but sort of a smog of microparticulate plastic. And they're making their way into the ocean system as well. So a lot of interest in the area in terms of environmental health as well as human health.
Yeah. And just to add to what Chris is saying, one of the problems, even with what are considered biodegradable plastics, is that temperature plays a very important part in their degradation. And so, when you think about the temperature, especially the oceans, for the most part, it's quite cool. And so that really slows down the ability of these things to break down.
Interesting. All right. So I want to just shift slightly to what are some of the sources of microplastics? And I'll read some stuff, but then I'm really going to turn it over to you both to add some details here. So I mentioned that when I was researching this, I kept seeing differentiation between primary and secondary microplastics. And I don't know how important that is for this conversation, but just flagging that primary microplastics are intentionally manufactured in a very small size for use in various products, including things like microbeads, tiny plastic exfoliants that I know I've seen in many facial scrubs, toothpastes. We'll say that certain countries do ban the use of microbeads, seeing more and more policies that are really cracking down on the use of microbeads due to their environmental impact. There are also synthetic fibers that shed from clothes and other textiles made from polyester, nylon, and acrylic. Granules used in industrial processes and cosmetics, often ending up, as we're discussing now, in waterways through spills or improper disposal. And then there are secondary microplastics, which, again, in my readings, that these are formed when larger plastic items break down over time due to things like you're saying, temperature, sunlight, wind, waves. And examples include things like plastic water bottles and grocery bags and packaging materials, microplastics worn off tires as they drive, fibers released from laundry of synthetic clothes, and so on and so forth. There's also been a lot, and I know where we should certainly spend some time talking about water in particular. And Chris, you were alluding to this, but we produce, something like 8 million metric tons of discarded plastic waste that makes its way to the oceans every year. And that statistic is from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And so many plastics float, certain plastic items of all shapes and sizes make their journey downstream, eventually making their way to the oceans. There's also littering, poor waste management, stormwater runoff, fishing vessels, cargo and cruise ships, and more. And I want you to talk about this idea of microplastics in water not just being an issue for bottled water, but it's also an issue for tap water, right? There was a study that I'll link in the show notes that found an average of 325 plastic particles found in a liter of bottled water as compared to 5.5 plastic particles per liter of tap water. That came out of Penn State. So I guess I just threw a lot out here. I mean, there's even more I'd love to talk about. Another study that found an alarming, it was something like 90% of the protein that we eat, like, the meats that we eat, but also things like tofu and seafood containing microplastics. So from your perspective, what are the most concerning sources of microplastics? What should be on our radar the most?
Well, water's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I mean, we consume a lot of water. To emphasize something that Norb said, as climate change raises its head, the degradation of these products and their behavior, their environmental behavior, is going to change, and it's probably not going to get better. It's the increase in temperature is going to add to the formation of these nanoplastics and microplastics. I was looking at work done by some researchers at Columbia University who, in fact, using Raman spectroscopy, which is a type of biophysical technique, not the noodle, have discovered disturbingly as much as 250,000 nano-sized pieces of plastic in water, in a bottle of water, a plastic bottle. That, of course, is concerning on many levels. An interesting thing is a lot of those nanoparticles were chlorinated or associated with chlorine, as if either the nanoparticle is adhering to other chemicals in the environment, or they may be derived from purification processes that are used in our water system. So that's something that will be investigated. We don't know the whole story there for sure. But it also raises the question of whether, as we replace our ailing water delivery infrastructure, which is commonly in cities like Washington, D.C., where I am, most of them are made, if they're not ancient and were made out of wood, but they're now made out of iron, those are being replaced by synthetics, and including plastic. So there's a lot of urgent questions that really need to be answered, and those are some things that I don't know. We just don't know how concerning they are right now because the research is lagging behind.
Mm-hmm.
And just to follow up on Chris's points, certainly we hear a lot about micro and nanoplastics being in water. But what really surprised me, and Chris, you may have actually been at this workshop that National Institutes for Environmental Health, they for years sponsored a committee through the National Academy of Sciences on emerging science and technology. And
Right.
And when I served on that committee, and Chris, you might have even been at that workshop, because I know you came
Yes.
to a lot of the ones that the committee organized, and we actually organized one on nano and microplastics. And what I found very interesting at that workshop is, again, we all focus on water, but surprising to me, what I learned at that workshop was that the number one route of exposure to micro and nanoplastics is through the air. And the reason that is because virtually all of our fabrics these days, from carpeting to our clothes to our furniture, to virtually every fabric in your home or that you may be wearing, has some degree of plastics in them. And actually, even a lot of the plastics that end up in water come from our doing laundry, and those plastics are coming off of our clothes. And so this actually is not only a huge issue in terms of human exposure, but it's also a huge problem when we try to do studies on plastics. Because no matter where you are indoors, you are going to have a lot of plastic particulates in the air. And so even if you're trying to do experiments in a laboratory, to have what one would consider a clean room with no plastic particulates is a huge challenge, and most laboratories who are working in this area don't have those facilities. And so it is hard to tell what's coming from the air versus what you've added to whatever your model system in the laboratory that you're studying. And the other big problem in studying these materials is that in most cases, when we do experiments, we have what are called reference standards. So they're very well-defined materials that one laboratory and another laboratory can use at the same time and compare their results. There are very few of these reference standards for experimentation in the area of plastics. So it's very difficult to compare results from one laboratory to the other because they're using different materials. So this is a very, very new but difficult area in which to do the kind of work Chris and I are, familiar with, toxicology, because there's a lot of obstacles or challenges in terms of doing these types of studies right now.
First thing, one would have to do, and, just as we've discussed, there's a lot of research that needs to be done. A lot of information gathering needs to be done. But the first step is to make sure you're working in a laboratory that is clean, right, that doesn't have background contamination from the product or particle you're trying to study. And it becomes very expensive to do that. And keep in mind, if you've ever been in a hospital lab or any lab whatsoever, and you look around, a lot of the equipment and materials that you're working with are made out of plastic, or they're partially plastic. So it becomes very difficult to do the research.
Yeah, including a lot of the PPE that is used in hospitals, right, and in laboratory settings in general.
Okay, so I'm hearing you both say that this is difficult to study properly. We've also discussed, so we're talking about it's difficult to study. We're saying that we're exposed to microplastics via water, we've talked about, via air, Norb, you raised. I want to share this one other study that has been making the rounds. This study conducted by researchers from the Ocean Conservancy and the University of Toronto. They analyzed more than a dozen different types of proteins, including seafood, pork, chicken, beef, and tofu. They found microplastics in nearly 90% of the samples they tested, and estimated that the average American adult may consume at least 11,000 pieces of microplastics each year. More specifically, they were saying per serving breaded shrimp had the most microplastics, followed by plant-based nuggets and chicken nuggets, chicken breasts, pork loin chops, and tofu had the least. They found they were theorizing that it might be the food processing that could be a source of contamination. Again, it was just theoretical. But this study got picked up, and I think, again, it's leading a lot of folks to think that our exposure, microplastics are ubiquitous, they're everywhere, we're eating them, we're drinking them, we're breathing them in. And then I guess my question is, that in combination with what you're saying about how it's difficult to study, it sounds like we don't know a lot. So based on all that, how scared, the people who are listening to this right now, there's a whole lot of anxiety. Do you think that anxiety is warranted? Do you have anything to say to folks about the fear that many of them are feeling?
Yeah, well, I'd like to circle back to part of the study that you just mentioned, because there have been a lot of studies looking at the potential of nano and microplastics, especially microplastics. Nanoplastics are hard to measure, but microplastics being present in seafood. Again, making that linkage to the oceans, and we do see these photographs and videos of plastic floating in the ocean. And so people have been very, very concerned about their seafood. And everything I've seen in the literature, and I've actually been working on a review paper in this area, quite honestly, it is very questionable how much of these plastic particulates actually are able to get out of the GI tract of seafood. That is where it's mostly localized. It is not in, for example, to any great extent in the flesh of fish. If you take out the GI tract, even if you take those shrimp and remove, I forget what you call it, but it's that large vein that most people, when they buy their shrimp, it's deveined. Yes. They don't want to eat that part. That will remove the majority of any plastic that's going to be present in your shrimp or other seafood. And there's actually been quite a lot of work done in that area in terms of looking at plastics in either fish or even the smaller, the shellfish, that people are eating. And so I guess that is the good news, because it's just not getting across the gastrointestinal tract of these various species. Now, nanoplastics, who knows, because those are very difficult to measure. And I think that is a big, big question, I think, for everybody. I don't know, Chris, if you've seen anything more recently in the literature, but I've not seen people really being very, very capable of measuring the nanoplastics. Those are a lot more difficult.
Yes, I think that's right. The equipment required to do a biological study, especially of the effects of nanoplastic at the cellular level, how they move through the body, their pharmacokinetics, and simply trying to record that information requires highly sophisticated equipment, which is not always available. But Jessica, to answer your question about should we be anxious, there's a lot, especially now. There's so much to be anxious about. We don't have any shortage of things to be anxious about. The word I would use is concerned, and informing oneself is it's kind of freeing. It frees you from the anxiety. There's a lot to be read. You have to be careful what you read, of course, and how verifiable it is. But the more we learn about not just plastics, but all kinds of things that are in our environment, the less anxiety I think we tend to face. There are many things, and perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about some of the things that an individual can do to reduce their exposure. And as an exposure scientist and a toxicologist, I always like to come to this place because we have we make a lot of decisions every day about our exposure, and we can learn about reducing our exposure, and if you're self-actuated to take steps to reduce your exposure, that's probably one of the best things you can do.
I was wondering if you could comment on two things. One, it sounds like research is really ongoing, but what do we think some of the health impacts of microplastics might be? Maybe commenting on that study, the potential cardiovascular effects, that would be helpful. And then also bioaccumulation. Do microplastics bioaccumulate in our bodies? And is that a concern as well? So if either of you can jump in, that would be awesome.
There's sort of a nomenclature thing about bioaccumulation. So there's a little bit of a difference, a subtle but very important difference between bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So certain things accumulate, but then they work their way into higher and higher concentrations through the food chain, through the food web. I don't know of any information that discusses or especially measures magnification of plastics. Not that it doesn't happen, but I'm not familiar with any studies that have looked into that. We know that they can accumulate, as we've already discussed. They can cross cellular membranes, cosmetics, foodstuffs that one might eat that have especially nanoplastics in them are likely to accumulate in the human body. Again, how they're eliminated or how they move through the body is really a black box right now. We don't have a whole lot of information about that. There was some work recently by Andrew West at Duke University in North Carolina looking at nanoplastics and their accumulation in nervous tissue. And Dr. West speculates somewhat about the role of those materials in causing Parkinson's disease. They seem to associate with a set of proteins that are also sort of co-located with neurons that are involved with Parkinson's disease. So, and there are some effects in animal studies. There are some mouse studies that show that the material can disturb the endocrine system. There are studies regarding activation of certain plastics and plasticizers that are used to modify plastic interacting with the estrogen receptor. So that's always a concern. Whether it's a particle or whether it's a chemical associated with the particle can activate certain cell surface receptors, and especially in the endocrine system, it becomes concerning. Not something to panic about, but folks like Dr. West are looking into that sort of thing. And that's the kind of research that we really need to understand and support.
Just to add, because I agree with everything that Chris has said, for me, the greatest concern, I think, for exposure is still from inhaled particulates, in part because the biological membrane, the cells that keep the external part of the environment away from the host, so to speak, in the lungs, it's basically a single cell barrier. And that's to facilitate the exchange of gases, being able to take oxygen in, which we really need to live, and to release, carbon dioxide as we use that gas. And so that the lungs, the inside of the lungs, we're really talking about a single cell barrier widthwise. The gastrointestinal tract is much thicker. And I think that just based on that alone, the ability of those plastics to get into the body through the lungs, it's probably going to be much easier than, when we swallow things through the GI tract, because it's a much thicker barrier.
Interesting. So with all this being said, and Chris, coming back to what you started talking about before, ways that we might be able to mitigate risk. So Norb, you're really highlighting inhalation and air as a exposure route. Are there air filtration systems that could be effective? And then just switching gears, maybe we could also talk about, are there certain foods we should avoid? Or there was something I mentioned to you about before we hit record, and I chuckled about your reaction. There's a lot of buzz about boiling water can effectively remove, I think the claim is something like 90% of microplastics in our water. What do we know? What's real right now? Can you help folks know how they could potentially minimize some of the risks?
Yeah, I mean, getting back to the airborne particulates, I don't know if anybody has invested in the kinds of filters that you would need to take out, especially these very, very small particulates. And so I'm really not sure what kinds of things are out there right now, especially for your home. I think Chris is probably going to talk about the consumption of, foods and water that have plastics. I think we have more control over some of that. But in terms of what's in the air, I think it's very difficult because these plastics are part of all the different, all the different fabrics that our homes are made of and the clothes we wear. It's very, very difficult to get that out of the air.
We've found, and NIEHS did quite a bit of research, Norb, as you probably know, on the use of home air filtration. Yeah. This is particularly important regarding wildfire smoke that almost everyone in the country has experienced over the past few years. And it turns out that they're extremely effective at removing particulates from indoor air. I have one right here next to me. But removing nano-sized particles is a different story, Norb. I don't know if the existing devices that we have, which are very effective at removing smoke-sized particles and probably microplastics, can remove nanoplastics. But that's a good area of research that I hadn't thought about, making an indoor air filter that could, in fact, keep those microplastics out of the breathing zone.
And what do you think about the boiling of water or any other ways to minimize exposure through food or water?
I don't think so. I don't, they might serve to break the particles down into sizes that are no longer visible, but the likelihood that boiling might volatilize certain really small molecules, but of plastic, but not nano or microplastics. I'm a skeptic when it comes to that. Certain water filtration systems, such as reverse osmosis, are probably pretty effective at removing plastics from drinking water. Unfortunately, they're not always accessible to everyone.
Got it. And when you say they're pretty expensive, I'm not quite sure. Is that?
Well, they're reasonably expensive.
Got it. Okay. And so are there other things? I mean, I know whenever I can, I tend to buy glass bottles instead of plastic. Right. I mean, that's a combination of things. I also just try to minimize my plastic use in general because of, environmental impact and all that. Is there anything else that you might recommend for folks? No.
Well, I think that's the big one. I mean, I think if you're using less plastic and drinking water out of water bottles is probably a good, plastic water bottles is probably a good idea.
Got it.
To minimize that exposure. Sure.
And what about when people leave water bottles in their car? That's a big no-no. Is that right? When you heat up the plastic and then you're drinking the water?
Probably not a good idea to do that. It's and it's not just the plastics, but it's the chemicals that are often used to make plastic either more pliable or stiffer that do have some endocrine disrupting effects, and heating them up is not gonna reduce that. It's probably going to increase the concentration in water.
Got it.
The other thing is the next time we all love our microfleece, but the next time you go to buy a new jacket, you might consider an alternative, a more biodegradable alternative. I'll probably get in trouble for saying that, but as Norb says, the microfleece that you run through your dryer really ends up in the air.
Wow.
Whether it's in your house or it goes out the side of your house to your neighbors is, it's still problematic. And I'll probably get in trouble for this too, but a lot of cosmetics have microfibers in them that are purposefully put there.
What I feel passionately about is I tend to fight back against a lot of fear mongering that I see in headlines, just in general. I'm not just talking about this. And I think that I learned a lot from this conversation. And what some of the things I learned is, yes, I mean, microplastics and nanoplastics, nanoparticles, it sounds like they are in a lot of places, and we are exposed via water, air, food, and other potential pathways. But we don't really know a lot about them. And so for some people, I know that leads to a lot of fear right off the bat, right? Because it's that fear of the unknown. And I think, Chris, it was you who said we should be concerned, but we don't necessarily need to panic over these things, right? And it sounds like this is a real focus for a lot of ongoing research now. A lot of this topic seems to have been brought to the forefront for a lot of researchers. So I'm not panicked right now, but I will maybe do some things to minimize my exposure. And then I guess the one final thing I'd love to ask you is, we're talking about individual exposure and mitigation, but do you have any thoughts on potential policies that potentially could help mitigate are there certain things that you think should not, maybe overall less plastic usage, but are there any policies that come to mind, things that you think we should be advocating for?
Well, I'll jump in first. I would not necessarily be in favor of drafting new policies until we know a little bit more about this topic, because often in our haste to do that, we often create other problems which may be even worse than the ones we're trying to deal with. But I do think that this is an area that really deserves a good bit of attention in terms of research, especially in terms of public health. And I'm glad to see that the amount of research being done in this area has increased tremendously. The only thing is that we need to make sure it is done well, because I can tell you just from the paper I've been working on, which I'm not done writing yet, but I've really come across a lot of questionable science, and that does tend to scare people because it often gets a lot of attention, and often is not really very well done.
I completely agree. We've had a lot of experience with trying to replace chemicals in the environment with alternatives. And often it turns out that the alternative is worse than the chemical that we were trying to replace. That happened with a very popular plasticizer called BPA, where the alternatives were questionable because the research, as Norb said, was questionable. And we do need to be very methodical and very careful about how we establish the science background for policy and regulation.
That's such an important point. Thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and weighing in on this topic. I hope we've allayed panic for some folks, answered some questions. Really, thank you both so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's good to see you both.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you. And we hope that you all found this interesting and enjoyed today's episode. I have some great episodes planned in the coming weeks. So definitely stay tuned for those. In the meantime, I'll continue to share infographics to the Unbiased Science social media channels. Be sure to give a follow at Unbiased SciPod. It would also be super helpful if you would leave us a review on Apple or wherever you're tuning in. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the Unbiased Science channel. Remember, there's also a Substack newsletter. It's free to subscribe, but if you're willing and able, paid subscriptions are much appreciated. Sincere thanks for tuning in and following along as we share no nonsense, just science.
Yeah, I am a scientist.